Change the battery, and now that works. So, welcome to St. John's. My name is Kevin Peil. I'm a member here at St. John's, and you're basically going to see what I've been doing for probably the last 34 years. This is a talk that's ever growing, ever changing, always adding new things based on feedback I get, and so on. So it should be a very informative time for you. I am a Christian. I've been a Christian my whole life. And I'm also a scientist, and I say that just not by name. I actually have a PhD in science, and I've worked for 34 years as a research scientist for multiple companies, for Dow Chemical, for Dow AgriSciences, and now for a company called Corteva, where I do basic fundamental research every day. And I've also been traveling the country speaking on matters as they relate to the Bible and science. I've spoken at many universities around the country on matters of creation and evolution and so on. Those talks are generally well received, but I'm here today to talk to you about a variety of things. Now, you all should have a handout, and that is, that's this thing right here. Okay, so this contains a lot more details on what it is that I'm going to present. So the way this works is I have a few slides that I step through, but I'll kind of talk through this, and I don't read this. You don't like people to read things to you, so I'm not going to read this to you. But I'll just kind of add to a lot of the things that are in here, and you can take this home. There's some suggested other places that you can go to get more information. My email is up there. If you actually want an electronic copy of all of this that you want to send out, just shoot me an email, and I'll send everything to you, and you can have it to share with your friends, family, your neighbors, co-workers, or whomever you would like. So let's start off with the first question. It's a big question. It's a big question that we wrestle with a lot as Christians. It's a question that I get asked a lot. And that is, did God really create the entire universe in 6 24-hour days? Was day 1 24 hours and day 2 24 hours? And did he really create over 6 24 hours? And the reason this is a question that we ask is because scientists tell us that there's really millions of years, if not billions of years of history that we somehow have to fit into the Bible. Scientists tell us, no, you have to trust us. The earth is really billions of years old. The universe is billions of years old. Humans have been on the earth for about 3 million years. And so we wrestle with, well, how do we fit all of this into the Bible? We even need to fit it in the Bible. How do we reconcile this? So this is where this comes from. This isn't coming from biblical scholars who are wrestling with this. These are scientific people that are telling us that we're wrong and we have to fit this into the Bible. Well, what do we say about this? The skeptic says, the word day can mean lots of different periods of time. Day doesn't necessarily mean 24 hours. It can mean a lot of different things. The sentence I like to use to describe this to people is as follows. In my grandfather's day, it took 10 days to drive across the country during the day. Okay? I'm using the word day 3 times in that sentence. Each time the word day means a different period of time. That first instance, in my grandfather's day, how long of a period of time is that day in my grandfather's day? Generations, decades? Do you think we could agree, everybody here, do you think we could agree on an exact definition of the length of day that's meant by my grandfather's day? Do you think we could agree on that? No, we probably could. It's indefinite. We don't know how long of a period of time that is. Okay, so that's interesting when it comes to the creation days, and I'll get to that in a second here. That second use of the word day. In my grandfather's day, it took 10 days. How long is that day there the second time in 10 days? 24 hours. I heard a lot of people say 24 hours. Now, the first use of the word day in my grandfather's day, we agreed that we couldn't agree on the length of time. Does anybody not agree that when I say 10 days, that word day means an indefinite, uncertain period of time? No, we're pretty sure of that, right? In fact, we're very sure of it. In fact, we're certain that it means 24 hours. What about the third usage? In my grandfather's day, it took 10 days to drive across the country during the day. How long of a period of time is that third usage? 12 hours, 6 hours? Well, it's seasonal dependent. So we have some disagreements here. So again, this third instance, do you think we could collectively agree where everybody would say, yep, that's exactly what it means when I say during the day? No. So here is the solution to the puzzle that I just presented to you about the creation days. You just figured out the solution. 3 uses of the word day. The second usage, we're sure that it means 24 hours, and the first 2, we don't know how long it is. Why is that? Well, I'll tell you why. There's a basic rule of English grammar that came into play here. Now, I'll get very English complicated here with you. When you have an ordinal modification of a length of time, you fix the length of time. What in the world does that mean? It means when you put a number before a length of time, you fix the length of time. Okay? Many weeks ago was our last snowstorm. Well, what do you mean, many weeks? How do you know? 4 weeks ago was our last major snowstorm. You see, when I took and I put a number before a length of time, I fix that length of time. That's a basic rule of English grammar. Counting time doesn't work in English unless we have this rule. This numerical or ordinal modification of a length of time, when you have that occur, must fix that length of time. You want to know the cool thing? That's the same grammar rule that applies in Hebrew, too. And the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. This same rule that I just gave you of grammar of English is the same exact rule that's used in Hebrew. So what do we have here? The evening and the morning were the first day. The evening and the morning were the second day. The evening and the morning were the third day. In Exodus, God created in 6 days and rested on the 7th. You too shall work for 6 days and rested on the 7th. Haven't you read? Jesus said, in the beginning, God created them male and female on the 6th day. You see, so we have in the creation account, every time the word day is used, there's a number that's put before it. In fact, if you look at the handout there, scholars have told us that the word yom, that's actually the transliterated Hebrew phrase for day, is yom. That's where we get, Yom Kippur, because yom means day. Scholars tell us the word day occurs 2,301 times in the Old Testament, and it almost always means a literal 24-hour day. Only 64 times, do scholars tell us, 65 times out of the 2,300 times is day used to mean an indefinite period of time. And every one of those 65 times, there's no numerical modification of it. In the days of the kings, in the days before the kings, judges ruled the earth. That second bullet point, when day is used in the plural form, in Hebrew that's yamin or days, 845 times in the Old Testament. Scholars tell us the 845 times that the word day is used in the plural in the Old Testament, every single time it means 24 hours. The passages, we're told by scholars, make no sense if the word days in those 840 some times means something other than 24 hours. When day is modified by a number or an ordinal in historical narratives, 359 times outside of the creation account. Outside of the first chapter of Genesis, outside of that, the word day occurs 350 some times with a number before it. Every single time it means 24 hours. Not most of the time, every time it means 24 hours. And when day, yom, is modified by evening or morning, that happens 38 times outside of the creation account. It always means a 24-hour day. The evening and the morning were the first day. The evening and the morning were the second day. Every time outside of the Genesis creation account that phraseology occurs, it is clearly understood to mean 24 hours. In fact, there's a very famous Greek professor of Hebrew at the University of Oxford, Professor James Barr. He wrote this: probably so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who dares not believe that the writer of Genesis 1 to 11 intended to convey to their readers the idea that creation took place in a series of 6 days, which are the same as the days of 24 hours we now experience. No Hebrew scholar, he tells us, doesn't agree that the writer didn't intend to convey that message. Now, he doesn't believe it, if you read him further, but he says it's clear that the writer intended the creation account to be described as 24 hours, and that was the message intended. I, as a scholar, don't believe that, he said, and then goes on. The Bible is very clear. The Bible is very clear on this, that those creation days were 24 hours. I refer again to the Exodus passage. When God is speaking to Moses and the Israelites, he says, "Your Lord God created the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So too shall you work for 6 days and rest on the seventh." Sociologists and scholars tell us it's quite odd that we have this 7-day week. That the 7-day week from ancient history is 7 days. Because 7 isn't divided by anything. 7 is a prime number. You can't divide it equally by anything. It doesn't go into anything equally. That's why our calendar is so goofy. That's why the different months have different number of days, and we have to throw in a leap year day, which is this year, right? Because the 7 doesn't make sense. So ponder on that, if you will. If somebody comes to me and says, "Yeah, but can't you allow for maybe millions of years to fit in?" I would start with Scripture and say, there's no way from Scripture that you can allow that. If you want to allow it, you have to say, "I don't believe this. I don't believe this. I know this is what the Bible says, but for me, I don't believe it." Can a Christian still believe in evolution? I get this a lot. People say, can a Christian still believe in evolution? If you get asked that, don't answer yes or no. Because that's actually not the question that you're being asked. And it is not up to us to decide, what the defining moment is if somebody doesn't believe every single written doctrine in the Bible. Maybe the young Christian they're just wrestling with this, right? It doesn't mean that they can't be a Christian until they fully embrace all of this. So I don't say yes or no. What I say instead is, just consider this. If somebody says to me, "Yeah, but, do I have to really believe in creation? Can I be a Christian and still believe in evolution?" Well, consider this. Consider that the origin of the gospel is found in the Garden of Eden. Consider that in the Garden of Eden is when the gospel was first proclaimed to mankind. In the garden, it was first proclaimed. If that is a myth, then Adam and Eve are just a representation of early humans that were becoming intelligent, then that conversation did not take place, right? And that was something that was kind of imposed on Scripture, because that conversation between God and a man and a woman, that didn't take place because the man and woman didn't exist, right? You see, with all of that. If evolution is true, then there would have been death before sin. If we had millions of years of survival of the fittest, animals dying, pre-humans dying, and the struggle, as Darwin said, nature red in tooth and claw. If that's the way it was, the world would have been full of death before there was even sin. I can't figure that out from a Christian standpoint. The perfect symmetry of Scripture. We often miss this. The Bible ends exactly the same way it ended. The Bible ends the same way it started, The Bible starts with perfect man and perfect woman living in perfect harmony with God, their Creator. And God describes to us at the end of Revelation that that's all going to be restored. And there will be a new heaven and a new earth with a new garden, with a new tree and a new river, where all of that's going to be restored. That full arc of the Bible ending just how it started is so important. Because if that first part, Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden creation, if that's all a myth and that doesn't make sense, well then maybe the last part doesn't make sense either. Our renewed relationship depends on the doctrine of creation. If mankind got to where it is through millions of years of struggle and evolution to get to where we are, God is not our Lord and Master. He's more of our life coach. He's more of our buddy that's got his arm around us, helping us. Oh, messed up there. Well, maybe the next generation will get it, right? God is more of our friend, our life coach, and our counselor than he is our Lord and Master. If evolution is true, that relationship with God completely goes out the window. Jesus accepted the literal account of creation. I hinted at this story, right, where some Sadducees come to Jesus and they say, this lady, she had 7 wives or 7 husbands and they all died, and before, who's going to be married? And they were very confused, right? They were very confused about people dying. Who are they? And so and Jesus says, no, you don't know the scriptures. You see, in the beginning, Jesus said, God created them male and female, and it is for that reason that a man leaves his family. See, Jesus goes back to the Garden of Eden to explain to them marriage. If that whole thing with the Garden of Eden is a myth, then what in the world is Jesus talking about? What was he talking about? This whole parallel of one man, one sin, one man, one salvation that Paul talks about in Romans is one of the deepest parts of Scripture you will ever read, where Paul goes on and on about, you have to recognize this. He says there was one man who committed one sin, and that one man and one sin condemned everybody. Now another man came, and he didn't sin, but this second man was greater than the first man that did. And you see, this second man that lived and didn't sin, if he's greater than the first man who condemned everyone, this second man will do more than save everybody. He just renews everything. If Adam was a myth, then Paul's talking nonsense. What do you mean the first man? So if folks come to you and say, well, yeah, but you can be a Christian, right, and still believe in evolution and not believe in creation, I would say, well, consider this and talk through them with this. The creation account, it's a foundational doctrine to everything that follows. If we throw out the first couple of chapters of Genesis, none of this makes sense. None of this makes sense at all to us. All right. Well, I've spent about 15 minutes on one question, and I got 10 more to go. So we'll go. I go a little quicker, I promise. It does go quicker. I've done this. This is the 3,000th time I've given this talk, so I promise you it will end on time. Okay. So here's another question about distant starlight. Okay, somebody say, okay, I get this whole, days of creation and so on, but scientists, they're looking at stars that are millions of light years away, and they're billions of light years away. And how can we see those stars here on the planet Earth? How can we see all of that? How can we see all those stars? The stars that are millions of light years away. You can sit out on a clear night. You can see about 4,000 to 6,000 stars with your naked eye, and some of the closest ones, or the farthest away ones that you can see, are a couple of million light years away. So that means it takes like 1,000,000 years for the light to come to us because it's that far. So that's a challenge you'll be given. Well, how do we answer that? How do we understand that as Christians? Let's go back to the Garden of Eden. Let's say we're walking through the Garden of Eden on day 7. We meet Adam and Eve. Well, hello, Adam and Eve. How are you? Well, this is a wonderful garden. Come on, let me show you around. Look at this. Look at this tree. Look at this tree. Look at this pear tree. Look at this peach tree. Look at these things. These are gigantic. They're full of fruit. And we're like, oh my goodness. This probably took you 50 years of constant cultivation and so on. And he says, no. It's only been here a couple of days. But wait a minute, we'd say, it looks like it's been here a lot longer. Nope, I know. I know. He says, I got a better one for you. How old do you think I am? You'd look at him, I don't know, 22, 23? He's like, no, I'm 1 day old. Well, how can this be? Let me show you something else. He says, look up at heaven, what do you see? And I say, man, I see thousands of stars. Thousands of stars. And Adam says to you, you know the closest star that you're looking at is a star called Alpha Centauri? And that star is 4.5 light years away. Adam says, that closest star right there that you're looking at, Alpha Centauri, it took 4.5 years for the light to come from that star to the planet Earth. And you're looking at it now, and you're looking at stars that are a lot farther away. And we say, Adam, how can this be? Adam says, the same reason that this tree is only 3 days old, and I'm only 1 day old, and those stars are only 4 days old. You see, ladies and gentlemen, God's creation was finished on day 7. It was done. It wasn't sort of done and ready to be revealed over time. It was done. So I like to say, when you view creation, God called things into being. It wasn't a let's like the stop action motion picture where things shook and you would see things coming together and they would form and then the skin would wrap around it and it would go up. No, God said, I want a flower right now, and a flower would appear right there. I want cattle to come out of the ground. Cattle came out of the ground. I want a tree there. Boom, there's a tree. A tree, fruit. It was there. It was ready. It was ready to go right away. Stars. Bing, I want stars. So he created the stars, and he also created the starlight at the same time to come down to us as well. Now, this challenges a lot of people. But see, that's what our faith allows us to do, is to understand these things not without science. We don't need science to understand this. Now, there's a lot more details that I can get into here, and I've got some things written in there too about some other thoughts that exist about, starlight and so on. And I'll just share one thing with you. We recognize that the speed of light is the fastest thing in the universe. Right? If you've ever read anything, you know that, right? Nothing can go faster than the speed of light. Does everybody know that, right? Nothing can go faster than the speed of light. That was just an idea that Einstein had. We've never really technically proved it. Einstein just had this idea that, in order for this to be true and that to be true, light, nothing can be faster than light, is what Einstein said. He spent a lifetime doing this. He won 2 Nobel Prizes. Very smart guy. We've never actually proven that. We've never actually done that. Scientists will measure things, the speed of light, and they'll measure it. One of the current things that's been going on is scientists realize they can't measure the speed of light unless they bounce it off something. Now, you can get 2 detectors a long ways away, and we say, okay, I got my walkie-talkie, I'm going to shoot my laser, and I'm going to start my stopwatch. I say now, you say now, and we go ahead and we shoot the light, and let's compare our stopwatches. Okay, that's the speed. But in order to do that, it's got to bounce off mirrors. It's got to bounce off stuff. You can't measure the speed of light unless you bounce it off something. Scientists have speculated, and it's becoming a growing consensus. The speed of light in one direction is actually infinitely fast. And whenever it bounces off something and reflects, that's what we measure. It's a really, really weird idea. It's very, out there. What do you mean the speed of light is instant? You mean if I flash a flashlight, you'll instantly see it a mile away? No, you'll see it at the speed of light because it has to flash, it has to bounce, it has to bounce off your eyes and so on. If we could somehow get light to travel without hitting or bouncing off anything or reflecting, scientists tell us that its speed would be infinite. So my point of bringing this up to you is not to do a deep dive into some weird modern physics, but to say the more we know about science and stuff like this, the more we don't know. Every generation brings to the table some ideas that are beyond the comprehension of the generation before it. Doesn't mean they're wrong, it just means it's novel and unique. That's the cool thing about science. So, I mean, look, I'm a scientist, right? I geek out about this stuff. I read a dozen books a year about science, right? I'm trying to teach myself quantum physics math, right? Because it's just so cool, right? It has no use at all in anything that I do, but it's just cool to kind of manipulate this and do this and say, oh, yeah, that's cool. That's why hydrogen exists. Okay, I get it now from this equation. That's why it exists, right? Okay, so let's keep going. I've completely lost my clicker. Here it is. Doesn't the fossil record support evolution and deny creation? You know, if evolution is true, we would expect to find, you know, evidence and fossils of life evolving and changing and growing and adapting and so on and so forth. We would expect to see that. What did I do here? Excuse me. Let me get back into screen show. Voila. Okay. So here's two views of life growing and changing on the earth. You got evolution at the top left, right? All life started as a single cell organism, unique and distinct in its own way, and from that, all life evolved. It's like this bush that's ever growing and becoming more complex. And evolution says we should be able to connect all life forms to other life forms through this evolution. Creation says God created all basic life forms or kinds. God created them according to their kind, told them to reproduce according to their kind. So basic kinds of animals, you know, that would grow and reproduce and so on. And then we had the flood that kind of wiped everything out. And then you can see the dinosaurs there, where the dinosaurs kind of went extinct. But everything continued to grow and change or so on, but no basic life form kind of changed into the other. So creation science says there is tremendous variability. There's a tremendous potential for life to adapt and become, you know, comfortable in its environment, and its offspring will survive more favorably. That's just observational science. We see that all the time. That's not evolution. Evolution says the basic types of life itself evolved into all the other basic types of life. And evolution demands that the fossil record would contain a record of this complete evolution of life throughout history. It really needs to have that. And I'm telling you folks, this is one of those rare times when I would say you have to trust me on this, you have to believe me on this. But I'm telling you, no matter what you may see or what you may read or what you may be told, the fossil record provides no indication of the origin of the basic life forms. A fossilized fish looks like a fish. A fossilized frog looks like a frog. Salamander like a salamander. A horse looks like a horse. A tree looks like a tree. Things look like they look today. The oldest bat fossil we have, scientists tell us, is 60 million years old. It is identical in every way to a modern bat. The oldest ostrich fossil we have that scientists tell us is 6 million years old is identical to ostriches today. I could go on and on with hundreds and hundreds of examples of the oldest fossilized forms of any modern life size we have today. Looks nearly identical to what scientists say was its ancestor, etc. So there is this order to the fossil record. This is very curious, and it troubled people for a long time. You know, if you drill down into the earth, if you start digging down into the earth, you're going to find fossils. The first layer that you're going to find complex life forms. You're going to find, you know, mammals, you're going to find birds, and the farther down you drill, the simpler the life form will become until you get all the way to the bottom, and the only life form that you will see are simple sea-based life that's very simple. And if you line that up, if you say, I've drilled down a mile into the earth and I'm going to line all those up, you see the change in this column that you dug out from very simple to very complex. Evolutionists say that as time evolved and things got buried and accumulated and deeper, what happened is we're getting a snapshot of life evolving. They will readily say, yeah, we agree, it kind of looks like the same life that's today, but notice the order, notice the structured order. They say, if evolution were true, that's exactly what you would expect to find in the fossil record. Well, how do we, as Christians and creation scientists, how do we account for that? It goes back to the flood. And I'm going to spend some time talking about the flood because it's very important to understand the impact that the flood had on the natural history of the earth. The flood was transgressive. All floods are transgressive. What that means is the floods grow and rise over time, right? Things sometimes are rapid, floods are rapid, but the thing is it's transgressive in nature and it slowly inundates an increasing amount of area as it grows. The life forms that get killed first in a flood are those life forms that are really living in the water. Because there's mudslides, there's things like that wind up burying them, and they wind up getting trapped and buried first. The second next form of life that gets caught in a flood are those life forms that are living right on the edge of the water. The farther the flood goes, the life that is increasingly intelligent is able to escape the flood longer and longer. If the flood is just local or regional, those most intelligent life forms can escape it and they're not buried. But imagine, if you will, if the flood was global. The flood would capture and bury first those simplest life forms that couldn't get away. And then as it continued to grow and the waters inundated and the waters rose, more and more complex life would be captured until the last intelligent, highest forms of life would be captured and buried less. You see, because of the flood being transgressive in nature, as all floods are, we would dig through the column in the earth and we would find life buried in the order in which the flood killed it. You see, folks, this nature of the fossil record is exactly what the flood would predict. And that's just not us guessing about the past, because that's what we observe today with floods overall being transgressive in nature. So let's talk a little bit about Noah's Ark. I read I read a lot, and sometimes I read too much, right? And I was just reading a newspaper article where somebody was mocking Christians that they believe some dirt farmer put 20 million animals in a wooden ark to live for a year, and I just laugh at that, and I says, where is this coming from? Now I focus on the number, 20 million animals on the ark. Where in the world did that come from? We have a good idea what the kinds of animals are. When God told Noah to bring 7 of every clean kind and 2 of every unclean kind on the ark, we're pretty sure what those kinds were. The Bible gives great descriptions about these animals, choose the cud, cloven hoof, and all of this, and we get a good sense about what clean and unclean was. But the kind, that's not a classification that we use today. We use things like species, genus, family, genre, kingdom, phylum, stuff like that. We don't use kind. But we have a rough idea about where the kinds would fall based on what we've learned about the genetics of animals. Let's start with the ark first. The Bible's very descriptive about the ark. It's very interesting, the incredible detail that's given on this. And in fact, a group of South Korean scientists built a scale model of the ark, and they put it in a wind and wave tunnel. They took 17 other ship hull designs of different scales and magnitudes, and they compared it to the ark. Because you look at that and you say a big rectangular box versus these modern hull shapes, this thing isn't going to last. These South Korean scientists did this. They published this work around the world, and they said not only was this shape of boat superior to all the modern ones, it was virtually uncapsizable. They simulated waves in their wave tank that were about 300 feet high. The ark was about 45 feet high. And these South Korean scientists said, we could not tip this thing over. It had the perfect length and width and height to be this bob that just would not tip over. So we look at this and we can construct a general shape of what the ark was. It had 3 decks, and it had a string of windows at the top. I always try to put on here, you see that what looks like a little black speck right down there? You see that right there? That's Noah to scale of the ark. Okay, that's how big this thing was to him. How long did he take to build it? Well, God told Noah that, he had made the decision that he was going to destroy mankind, and in 120 years, this was going to happen, right? So generally, we think that, it was over that period of time. Now, a lot of, creation scientists think that it wouldn't have taken him 120 years. It probably would have taken, half that amount of time, given the technology that existed. But it was almost as if God wanted this to stand as a testimony to the people of the day to see this, as I believe Noah would continue to preach to those around him, and they had no excuse but to look at this, and they would probably laugh at him, and he would continue to call them to the dangers that were coming their way. This was a very massive ship here. Yes? Yeah.
So he wasn't even building this near water.
Right. He wasn't building it near water. Right. He probably built it near where it landed, because a lot of people think that the ark itself, once it flooded and it went up, it just kind of did this, just kind of did this, and then it just kind of dropped down. So he would have built it in that region, which is very arid and desert-like. And he's right. There's a lot of talk about what the environment was like prior to the flood. And there's a lot of people that speculate and say there was no rain prior to the flood, that there was this vapor canopy that covered the earth, and so on. It really gets complicated. If you want to hear more about the flood, I'm going to be speaking in Flint in a couple of weeks. On this Thursday, in fact, I'm speaking in Flint, and I'm going to be talking just about the flood there and all these details. So, but how many animals were on the ark? We basically have a rough idea where the kinds would have been. They would have been about at the family level that we have today. So, like the dog family. Right? Noah would have brought 2 of every dog onto the ark, 2 of every dog kind. So from these 2 dogs, representing the 1 dog kind, today we have all the domestic dogs. We have hyenas, we have jackals, coyotes, you name it. Cats, he would have had 2 cats representative of the cat kind, from which today descended all the modern house cats, leopards, cheetahs, cougars, tigers, lions, you name it. I always say this, if you ever have a cat at home, right, watch this, and not all cats do this, right, but watch your cat, because our cat will do this. When it gets done eating, it will get up, and one of the first things it will do sometimes is it will shake all 4 of its paws. It will shake all 4 of its paws. Scientists tell us that that's an imprinted instinct from the cat ancestors who are out in the wild, sitting in the dirt, laying in the animals that they were eating, and when they got up, before they walked, took a step, they would shake all the blood and guts and stuff off their paws so they could walk away and not get it on them. If you have a cat, watch. Not all cats do this, right? They do. But watch. It's fascinating to see that imprinting that has lasted all this time. But we can go through and we can catalog all of this. And this study that I'm quoting here was done in the 80s. It was 84, 85. And John Woodmarap is the individual that did these calculations, Dr. John Woodmarap. And he calculated, and it was pretty serious, that there were 15,746 animals on the ark. That included 7 of every clean, 2 of every unclean. If you've ever been to Answers in Genesis Ark down in Kentucky, Hebron, Kentucky, right? They like a little lower number. I think they have like 7,000 or something that they post on there because their studies have indicated something a little differently. Right? This is not a very, very serious thing that we argue about as scientists. But the thing is, it's not 20 million. Okay? So if somebody chides you for this, they just not only are not up on what we've done here and so on with this. All right, how much food and water was there on the ark? Okay, so let's take 16,000 animals. We can pretty readily calculate, given their sizes. So Dr. Woodmarap, if you notice that table, it had all the different weights and sizes. That's how much food would have been needed, how much water, etc. And so you look at it, you can calculate, you say the animals themselves would have taken up about 50% of the ark. About half of the ark would have been taken up by the animals. About, what do I have here? About 10 to 15% of the ark would have been filled with fresh water, and about 10% of the ark would have consisted of Noah's family, tools, clothing, seeds, edible plants. Would have been about 25 to 30% of the ark. And God gave Noah and his family some meaningful labor. While they were entombed in this ark for 371 days, they had 16,000 animals to care for. There is nothing more enjoyable than taking care, of little animals and feeding them. And I'm sure the days, were sometimes tough with the boat rocking and all of this, but you can really see God's providence in caring for these 8 individuals in the ark, that he gave them very meaningful labor over that period of time, to keep their minds occupied and things like this. I like to joke and say this was like packing for the camping trip of all camping trips. You can imagine Noah and his wife and their sons and daughters saying, "No, do you think we should bring this?" "Yes, you should bring it." "What about?" "Yes, we should bring it." Okay, because when they got off the ark, it was like they were landing on Mars, right? There would have been nothing. They needed everything they had to take with them. And that was probably what a lot of that period of time was done. Once the ark was built, now it was time to start filling it. The animals came to Noah and his family. God spoke to the animals and sent them to them. But they would have had to pack and prepare. They probably, were preserving food more so, and things like that. And, the interesting thing is, this is a little tidbit that sometimes we miss. When Noah and his family came off the ark, and God's speech to them, he says something that's very interesting. He says, "Where I once gave you the plants of the earth to eat, I now give you animals to eat. But," God said, "I will put the fear of man in them." So before that, the fear of man was not in animals, because God said on that day, "I'm going to now put the fear of man in them." Because God said, "You can go ahead and hunt and kill animals. I want to give them a fighting chance. So I will make them scared to death of you, so they will run away." Before that wasn't happened. In a sense, you could say there were no wild animals on the ark. They all would have been tamed because none of them had the fear of God in them. Again, that speaks to God's providence and care of the 8 individuals on the ark that day. Is there physical evidence for the flood? Yeah, there's lots of physical evidence for the flood. Earth's geological features require a catastrophic explanation. There are water-deposited sedimentary rocks that you can trace around the earth. You can go to the Grand Canyon, and geologists will say, "You see that seam of red sandstone right there? You see where, oh yeah, it starts there. Yep, and it ends right there." And he says, now trace it. And you'll trace it, and you'll see it go across the Grand Canyon, and it'll go across the Grand Canyon, and he'll say, "Now, if we go to the Appalachian Mountains, that seam of rock is in between the same 2 seams that it's in between here in Colorado, out in Virginia in the Appalachians. That same layer of rock occurs. You can trace," they say, "that seam all the way across the United States." But wait, the geologists will say, "You think that's cool? Let's fly over to Europe." You can do the same thing there. In fact, geologically, geologists have traced globally all these different seams of rock that look like they were deposited by water, and they're deposited all around the world. And they say, "Isn't that remarkable?" And you say, well, what caused that? Well, water caused that. Water causes deposition. So it caused the deposition the same way around the world? Yes, the same way around the world. So it was almost like floodwaters around the world? Yes, just like floodwaters. So like the floodwaters of Noah? No, not that. A different global flood. A different global flood that would have wiped out everything and carried everything. Okay, so a different global flood than the one in the Bible. Right. As I often say, it's unbelievable what an unbeliever will believe to be an unbeliever. Right? What does Paul say? The fool has said in his heart. Not the educated, well-discerning person. He says the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Large coal, oil, and ore deposits are not forming today. Fossil beds are all over the place. You know, the origin of civilization is really near the Ark landing. Even secular scientists, evolutionists tell us that humans first developed civilization in cities in that Middle East area, in Turkey, right? You know, Iraq. That's kind of where the first civilizations occurred. Mount Ararat is in eastern Turkey. Right? So we would exactly expect evidence of the first civilization to be in that area, and that's what secular scientists tell us they find indeed. You know, written history only goes back about 5,000 or 6,000 years. No matter what anybody may tell you, the oldest written records we have are 5,000 to 6,000 years old. Pottery, agriculture, domestication, metallurgy, cities themselves are no more than 11,000 years old. Now that's a little bigger number than maybe we're comfortable with, right? But it's not millions of years as we go back there. The oldest living trees are called the bristlecone pines, and they date to about 5,000 years ago. And population statistics suggest that it takes only several thousand years to get to the level of population that we have today on the earth. So I talk about great fossil beds. There's a really cool fossil bed off the coast of Peru. The latest study of this says that there are 346 complete whales that are buried in a single layer of sedimentary rock over a 370-acre area, and all those dots there represent that, right? These scientists marvel at this 360 whales were all buried at one time instantly and wiped out and killed instantly. There's no phenomena that happens today that even comes close to duplicating this type of catastrophic rapid burial. Now, I'm not saying that these were killed in the flood, but if they were, they would look exactly like this. Out in Montana, there's a fossilized bed called Egg Mountain, Montana, where by some estimates there are 10,000 dinosaurs buried in mass over a 300-400 acre bedrock area. These dinosaur skeletons are all disarticulated. These dinosaurs are torn apart. I read a statistical study where these scientists said, you know, it's interesting, we cataloged these 10,000 dinosaurs, and you know, the majority of them, they're kind of all facing one direction, and the smaller bones are way at the end of the deposit, and the bigger bones are in the middle, and the very large bones are at the end. They said it was almost like this 10,000 herd of dinosaurs was wiped out at one time in an instant by something that hit them all, turned them all in one direction, ripped their bodies apart, and threw the bones. Smaller ones went further, medium ones not as far, and bigger ones right here. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, this herd of dinosaurs was wiped out in the flood. This is exactly what we would expect for something like this. Was there really an ice age at one time? Yes, there was. Yes, there was an ice age at one time. Scientists will say that there were 5 ice ages. The only evidence of an ice age we have is the last one, because any ice age before it would have been wiped out. But yes, there was an ice age. It lasted for about 400 years after the flood. The model that we come up with here is the acronym HEAT. You see, after the flood, rapid tectonic plate movement during the flood would have created hot new seafloor, heating the oceans. It is thought that the oceans would have been very, very hot during the flood, volcanoes erupting, the fountains of the deep erupting. The Atlantic Ocean from the North Pole to the South Pole is a string of volcanoes. That's called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. That's where the earth is ripping itself in two. And Europe and Africa are moving easterly, and North and South America are going westerly at the rate of about 2 inches a year, because the earth is still oozing. It's like a giant zipper was unzipped. And that's when scientists says, if we take all the continents and we put them together, they kind of fit into one continent. And you've seen this before. You've seen pictures of one landmass. You take North and South America and you slide it, they fit in just perfectly. And that little V shape that's up there is right where Greenland would jump in and like that. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is right in the middle of that. We believe that the Mid-Atlantic Ridge was the fountains of the deep that erupted and is still slowly erupting. Imagine thousands of volcanoes erupting underneath the ocean floor, how hot the water would have gotten. Because of hot water, that second bullet point, tremendous amounts of evaporation. These warmer oceans prompted more precipitation to fall on the earth and building ice sheets. You heard mention here about maybe there was no rain before the flood. Maybe there was a vapor canopy. The earth's climate was much more temperate, right? And all of a sudden, the vapor canopy was gone. There was no more protection. Just tons and tons of rain and snow coming down. The aerosols from this runaway subduction of the old ocean and more volcanic activity would have blocked the sunlight, right? These volcanoes, so what the Bible tells us is the water stopped rising, right? And God caused a great wind and he moved the continents to cause the rain. But these volcanoes were probably still spitting here or there, right? Still spitting aerosols, and there's probably still a lot of aerosols in the air. Right, so not only was the ocean warm, putting a lot of moisture in the air, but the atmosphere itself would have been much colder because of these aerosols that are blocking the sun. You put that all together and you really have a runaway scenario where a large portion of the earth would have been frozen for several hundred years. The book of Job, when God comes down to Job's friends and he's lecturing Job, and he talks to Job about all the wonderful things around him, and God says to Job, "From whose womb came the ice, with the surface of the deep now frozen?" He tells Job, "Job, look at this ice. Whose womb do you think that came from? It's massive." Job, we recognize as being one of the oldest stories in the Old Testament, for a lot of reasons, right? When I say the oldest, probably the first story after the flood that would have taken place, because there's a lot of things in there that happened that make us think that it took place even before Abraham. So God is telling, Job, look at all this ice. It's just incredible. Okay. What about genetics? Doesn't all the genetic data that has been amassed prove evolution? I mean, we know a lot about genetics. Haven't we learned a lot about that? We're gonna give you 3 examples, and we're gonna start with the ladies. Ladies first. We will start with a part of the genome we inherit from our mothers. Now, we all have DNA in our body. We all do. And we inherit from our mothers only something called mitochondrial DNA. Every person in this room has mitochondrial DNA, but you only got it from your mother. So we can trace our lineage through our mothers all the way back as far as we want to go by comparing the differences in our mitochondrial DNA. If we were to take everybody in this room, that first bullet point, everybody in this room, we were to look at just your mitochondrial DNA and we analyze it, we would have on average 40 different mitochondrial DNA differences in our mitochondrial DNA. It'd be about 40. Given the measured mutation rate of mitochondrial DNA, scientists tell us to accumulate an average of 40 differences amongst all of us, it takes about 4,000 to 8,000 years for that to occur. Now, evolutionists say if we've been around for 2 million years, there should be on average 1,000 differences in our mitochondrial DNA amongst us. There should be 1,000, they tell us, because we've been around for 2 million years, but there's only 40. How can that be? This is where scientists have come up with the phrase mitochondrial Eve. They say from our mitochondrial DNA, we can probably figure out the genetic imprint of our mother, which we will jokingly call mitochondrial Eve, and so on. What about the men? Men today inherit the Y chromosome from our fathers. So ladies have two X chromosomes. Men have an X and a Y chromosome. Women don't give boys a Y chromosome. The fathers give the Y chromosome. So just like with mitochondrial DNA, we looked at the ladies, now we'll look at the Y chromosome, just look at the men. If we look at our Y chromosome, there's quite a lot more mutations in that. Every man in this room would have about 600 to 800 mutations in their Y chromosome. And if we line all those up and we say, well, the average Y chromosome mutates at a rate of 3 variants per generation, we can say, well, when was Y chromosome Adam alive? Indications that we're all descended from the same male ancestor from this analysis about 200 generations ago, which would be about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. So geneticists, secular geneticists tell us that our mitochondrial DNA from our mothers says that mitochondrial Eve lived 4,000 to 8,000 years ago. Our Y chromosome Adam lived about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. The signature here of Adam and Eve is unmistakable here. This is data that's probably 20 years old. I've been doing this for 35 years, right? So the first 15 years, I had no idea that this was going to come. The more we know, the stronger the case comes for creation science and what we're doing, and the weaker the case for evolution becomes. A massive DNA study was published in 2018. These scientists looked at over 100,000 different animal species, and what I just did for us with our mitochondrial DNA and our Y chromosome, they did the same thing for 100,000 different animal species. And they wanted to see if we can line up the genetics with this same technology and see the evolution of life over history. The conclusion from this is that the amount of variation and mutation in these 100,000 animal species was about the same for every single animal species. That third bullet point. These scientists say that about 90% of all animal life today has been around for about the same amount of time. And that conclusion there, and if you want to study this more, if you have access to these higher journals, this principal author said, it is more likely that at all times in evolution, the animals alive at this point arose relatively recently. See, evolution says animals evolve over time, they change. These scientists looked at 100,000 animal species, and he said they have the same level of mutation in their genes. They says it's almost like all these animals that we studied have been on the earth for the same amount of time. That's ridiculous, they said. How can that be? One of their conclusions is, I don't know how we can keep using genetics to prove evolution, because it's giving us the wrong answer. It's saying that from mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome, we've only been here for 4,000 to 6,000 years old. 100,000 animal species, they've only been around for the same amount of time. They're like, this isn't working. We need to find another method to prove our point. Oh, wait a minute. I thought evolution was proven. I thought the data that was amassed actually pointed scientists in this direction. And so that's not true. It's the opposite is true. That's very interesting. We're not told that, are we? I mean, are we aware of this? Are you aware of this genetic information? It doesn't fit the predefined notion of what things must be. Now, I'm just not some lone wolf here. right? I belong to many Christian science organizations, the Creation Research Society, thousands of members. You have to have a master's degree in science in order to be part of that. I work with many, many PhD scientists that I've worked with for decades, and those men and women could stand up here today and give the same exact talk that I just did because they feel the same exact way. I'm telling you, from inside this ivory tower of science that has only allowed a few people to go in and see, I tell you that inside, when we look out, it is not what you think. We do not know what we think we know. Okay, what about climate change? What in the world does this have to do about the Bible? I specifically to speak on this, okay? I am the most apolitical person you've ever met. Not only am I not a member of either party, I can't stand either one of them. I vote only because I'm a Christian man and it's my civic duty. And I plug my nose every time I do it. Remember, if you say I'm voting for the lesser of two evils, remember you're still voting for an evil. Okay? Don't vote for the lesser of two evils. So, it's hard to talk about this without bringing in the cesspool of politics that surrounds this topic on this. What do we know? What do we know? What we know is what history tells us. I cataloged here some periods of time going back to about 750 BC, when we first started to track the weather over time and the Egyptians started to write it down. The Egyptians would say how often the Nile would flood, how often there were famines, how often there were cold winters and warm winters. It was really about that time the Egyptians started to write all this stuff down. And you notice we go from a cooling to a warming period. When Jesus was alive, theologians call this the Pax Romana, right? The great peace of the Romans. It allowed the gospel to be spread relatively straightforwardly because, the Romans controlled the world, but the Romans controlled the world. And they built roads, and they were civilized people. That was a period of time, it was considered one of the warmest periods in our history. The written history we have shows that grapes and olives grew further north in Europe than they even do today. Then we get into the Dark Ages. We recognize the Dark Ages as being, disease and famine and pestilence, but we may not recognize that it was a very cold period. The weather was very unpredictable. It was a very difficult period in human history. Trade all but stopped. Disease was rampant. The average age of a man in the Dark Ages was something like 43 years old or something. I mean, that's crazy. Then we have the medieval warming, another long period of time. The Norse people, the Vikings, colonized Greenland between 900 and 1300 AD. Many of the great castles and cathedrals of Europe were built during this time. Greenland was fully populated. There were farms and vineyards. Greenland today is a frozen tundra. Yet at one time it was lush with lots of vegetation. Then we have a period of time called the Little Ice Age, and the beginning of about 1850 to now we have this current warming period. Now, if you're good at math, if you're quick at math, what's the approximate length of time for each warming and cooling period here? 400 years, 500 years? It varies. It's not exact, right? The warming period didn't start on September 12th. It gradually kind of ebbed and flowed. There's a website. There's two gentlemen, Cliff Harris and Randy Mann. They're climatologist buffs. They're all about the history of the weather. Their website is breathtaking to go to it. And this is where I get all of this. I gave you 1% of 1% of what is on their website with this. This is a figure that they have there. They're all about tracing the history. They want to understand today's time based on history. If you want to dig into this issue, if climate change is something that you want to learn more about, I would encourage you to go to these gentlemen's website first and learn the history of the climate and the weather. What I just showed you is what is being shown here, where they kind of marked these warming and cooling periods. Now you notice I haven't said anything at all about today's weather, right? Dr. Peil, are you a climate alarmist or a climate denier? No, I'm a scientist that looks at the data, and this is where I start. I see the period of time that we're in is just the latest warming period that started in 1850. Ha! You're a liberal Democrat, I can tell. See, that's the problem with climate today. You have 5 seconds to have a conversation without it becoming political. Try as you may, you cannot. You cannot have this discussion outside of politics. Whenever politics takes over an issue, it becomes bipolar in nature. And you have sides, right? We don't talk about genetics. The genetics that I talked about doesn't depend on your political affiliation. It's about science and what the data says. But see how this has become what it is today? It's madness. Now, I've got in my handout there, some comments, that I've collected and so on. Let me get to them. There's a lot of books that I've read. You can find books too. You can find books. There's I could tell you many of the distinguished climate scientists that I have read and gone to their website and read their books. They're almost somewhat embarrassed by what they call the state of affairs in government when it comes to climate change. And a lot of people will dive into this head first. A lot of these climate scientists will dive into this head first, right? And a great many that I've read that I've said, well, I just can't do this anymore. I just can't do it. It's just too combative. I can't even go to these climate conferences anymore because there's protesters outside. There's people. They say we just can't do this anymore. And you read this, and again, I'm not making excuses. But the increasing dismay that I can tell you from the technical community is because this issue has become hijacked by politicians. Okay, so what do we do? We're in church. I'm giving a talk on science in the Bible. This is just my message here on this topic, is how's a Christian to respond? I would not even focus on whether climate change is real or not, and instead focus on what's going on. Focus on this. Focus on the current warming magnitude seems to be no different than the past warming magnitudes. Collective expectations, the Earth will be another 1 degree warmer over the next 100 years without any reduction in our human emissions. Should we be concerned about the amount of emissions we're putting in the environment? Should we be concerned about that? Absolutely we should be. You're darn right we should be. We're stewards of God's earth. Stop polluting. Stop throwing trash out in your backyard. Yes, absolutely we should be concerned about this. Yes, we want energy efficiency. Yes, we want to do this. Yes, burning coal all the time concerns me too, because it's very dirty and it goes up there. But we don't have another alternative. I love nuclear energy. It's my favorite form of energy. It's impossible to build a nuclear plant anywhere in North America. It's impossible to do that. Okay, so we'll put up, solar panels. Wonderful technology. It's about 45% efficient. The technology hasn't changed in 60 years. It only works when the sun's shining. There's no means to store the battery that you could make from this. Wind turbines are wonderful, and great on. You drive around, Saginaw and out in the thumb, and it's almost like, oh my goodness, I'm on like a landscape out on the Mars or something. I mean, it's just, you see these turbines going around, and I feel for these people living in these houses, and they're like, I used to be able to go outside and look around, and now all I see is these, so I get it. I completely get it. There's no perfect answer to this. There's no perfect answer to this. We have been reducing emissions tremendously. And in fact, we've been reducing emissions over the decades at the current rate that if we have another 300 years, before realistically the temperature will rise about another degree. You know, all these warming and cooling cycles, the human population survived just fine. They had no idea what was causing the warming or the cooling. They just adapted to it. They just adapted. We too will adapt. If you find yourself concerned about this issue, by all means, dig into it. But my encouragement would be to focus on our ability to adapt over time to the warming. The warming will continue by a degree or two, but we will adapt. In fact, we will thrive as a people if, God willing, He doesn't call us home with the second judgment in time. Right? This isn't evidence of some apocalypse. It's the continuing cyclical nature of our climate on the earth, no different now than it was for the last 2,000 years. It's exactly the same now. If you say that to anybody, you will be shouted down. Right? All right, so let's finish off with a fun one. Why did humans once live for 900 years and now they only live for 90 years? Did Adam really live for 900 years? Did Methuselah live for 969 years? Crazy talk. That's crazy talk, right? Well, I went through the Bible and I plotted the age at the time of death of everybody that's listed up until about Jacob is what I've got there. And what you see is there's not a randomness here. Everybody lived for basically 900 some years and then they died. And then something happened around the 11th generation, where those being born after the 11th generation lived for half as long. What happened on the 10th generation on the earth? The flood. The flood, that's right, the flood happened. There's something in biology called the founder's principle, or another name is called genetic bottlenecking. Genetic bottlenecking says if you take a huge population and you take a very, very tiny subset, and you isolate it so it has no further interaction with any of the other population, they can only breed amongst themselves, that small subset will be less fit to survive. It will lose a lot of the genetic diversity. The ability to interbreed and intermarry keeps the genetic diversity at its highest form. If you take a small subset and you put them on an island, they will lose a large fraction of that genetic information. Do you see how the flood was a genetic bottlenecking event and how those afterwards were survived? And then all of a sudden you notice there's another jump at the 15th generation. This is a bit uncertain, but it's thought that's about when the Tower of Babel was. It was about the 15th generation, right? Do you see how the Tower of Babel, everybody spoke the same language, everybody intermarried, and all of a sudden everybody was confused. They couldn't speak to one another, and so they moved and they scattered around the earth. Do you see how those people that could only speak the same language would then only intermarry and have kids? In a sense, they were little, multiple, mini bottlenecking events that occurred that, again, caused the population to drop very quickly. Until we get to the time of the patriarchs, right? And Moses' psalm. Moses wrote one psalm in the Bible, right? He wrote one psalm, and he said, I'm going to paraphrase, a man lives for, 80 years, and then he dies. So even at the time of Moses, he was talking about people living for 80 years or so, and then they die, and things like that. So, okay, something I just added because this has been in the news. What about all the planets outside our solar system? You see there have been some recent studies. We have this new James Webb telescope. I mean, I love astronomy. I'm just getting into it. I just got my telescope, bigger one. It's so cool to sit away and look at the rings of Saturn. Because you're not looking at a picture of Saturn, you're looking at Saturn. Right? And to do that is it's chilling to be able to do that. So we have this James Webb telescope, right? It's 1 million miles from the Earth, and it's pointed away from the sun because we wanted the clearest shot that we could get of everything. It's discovered, and this goes back to the Hubble telescope, we have found over 5,000 other planet systems, In other words, a sun with planets revolving around it. So scientists will look out of the Hubble telescope and they're like, look at that star, isn't that... Oh, there's just a little streak went through it. Did you see this? Watch. Just watch. Wait, it'll happen again. Watch the star. See, there it is again. That streak went through it. I'm going to time this. I'm going to see how long it takes. You know what? It happens every 17 days. It goes around. Every 17 days that streak is going, and then somebody says, you know what that is? That's a planet revolving around that star. And when it goes in front of it, it's blocking out the sun a little bit, and you're like, oh yeah. And then they look at other ones and they're like, watch. It's not like it's the same planet going on. It's almost like there's three of them because I can't get the period figured out because it's not the same. But if there's three of them, if there's three planets that are equiplanar, that would explain why I'm seeing this. And they figured it out, and it's just like that. 5,000 planetary systems outside our solar system we've discovered. This is the latest one. This is the one that this was discovered from the James Webb Telescope. It's 100 light years from the Earth, so it's only 100 light years away. 6 planets, each one a little bit bigger than Jupiter, revolving around this sun. And the interesting thing is, all planetary systems are equiplanar. In our solar system, you go with Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. They all lie on the same plane. If you were to look at it far away, all the planets are on the same plane with that. That's what we find in all these other planetary systems. Again, that's one of the clues that we use to know when it's a planetary system. When we see the star blinking in a periodic fashion, we recognize that as a planet going around. 5,000 of these planetary systems that we've discovered. Okay, wait a minute now. This is getting pretty crazy here. Does this concern the Christian? Are you concerned that maybe our solar system isn't unique? Is it? We've got the Bible. You see, the earth is not the center of God's creation. What's the center of God's creation? Raise your hand. You are. You are the center of God's creation. No planet, no tree, no animal is the center of God's creation. You are the center of God's creation. You are what God thinks about every day, every second. You are the center of God's creation. The closer we get to knowing God, the more we don't know. How lucky it is for us to be alive today to see this facet of God's creation. And we scratch our heads and say, okay, God, I give up. I don't get it. I don't get it. This is amazing. This is absolutely amazing. God's creation is more complex than we could ever imagine because God himself is more complex than we would ever know. But God does talk to us through his scripture. He does talk to us, and he lets us know his mind and what he's thinking. As Peter said in his epistle when he described Paul's writings, he said, Paul writes some things that are hard to understand, right? And God says some things to us that are hard to understand. But you have to let God be God. If God really is who he says he is, all-knowing, all-being, everywhere, complete wisdom, everything, who are we to think that we're even going to understand 1% of what he is about? So when God pulls the curtain back a little further and we see more, we just say, okay, that's enough. I can't. When Paul said, when he was given a glimpse of heaven, and he said, this is too much for me. This is too much for me. I have to look away. This is too much for me. These planets out in our solar system, it's just the fingerprint of God that we see surrounding us. And it's just continuing to confirm how wonderful things are. There are a lot of good creation websites. If you find yourself wanting to dig into these topics more, I'm not just an island here. There's lots and lots of things. I stand on the shoulders of giants who have spent lifetimes working on this type of thing. There are some for you to go to. If you haven't been to the Creation Museum in Noah's Ark in Kentucky, please do so. It's wonderful. Spend one day at each. Don't fool yourself that you're going to do them both in one day. I would do Noah's Ark first because it's very focused. It's very focused on the Ark. And the Creation Museum, and you walk through this life-size Garden of Eden, and it's just incredible. They're great fans of Luther. They actually have a display on Martin Luther. Ken Ham himself, who founded both of these, he's actually said he considers himself a modern-day Martin Luther, calling Christians back to the foundations of Scripture. I ran into Ken Ham at the Detroit airport one time. Wonderful man, very gracious, tall as the Dickens, like 6'6", you know. And his joke is, so he's Australian, he's got this heavy Australian accent, and his joke is always is, I'm not sure if you can understand my accent, but you better get used to it because it's the accent we'll all have in heaven. And I says, nope, I can understand you just well. I actually had on my St. John's Church when I was with him, and he says, oh, you're Lutheran. What synod are you with? And I said, the Wisconsin Synod. And he says, oh, I'm speaking at the Missouri Synod National Conference. This was like probably 5-6 years ago. This is way before COVID, right? And he said, yeah, I'm speaking at the Missouri Synod National Conference. He said they invited me to speak there. So, okay, so there we go. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. There's my email. Any questions that we have? I have no idea. It's still light out, so it's not 8 o'clock yet, but yeah. Yeah, so carbon dating, right? There's a litany of questions that you're going to have on what about this, what about that. I didn't talk about this. Carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 dating is used to date fossils, right? We get tens of thousands of years old and so on. One of the things that we've done is we've started dating dinosaur fossils. We never dated dinosaur fossils before because they were thought to have died off 65 million years ago. Carbon-14 dating doesn't work for something that old. There was a professor, Mary Schweitzer, who was working on a Triceratops horn. And it was her horn. Her institute owned it. She's like, I'm going to cut this thing open. I'm going to look inside of it because I want to do some microgrowth. She cut it open. You know what came out of it? Blood. Blood came out of it. She published tremendous papers on this. She took pictures of red blood cells of dinosaurs. She carbon dated those first dinosaur horns, and they came back to be 15,000 years old. Creation scientists jumped on this, and we have since, at the Institute for Creation Research, we have dated hundreds and hundreds of dinosaur fossils. We get tens of thousands of years old for them. We don't get millions of years old. That's just an example. We never dated coal before because it said coal was formed millions of years ago. We date coal, we get it to be thousands of years old, right? It's an interesting thing, so. Anything else? Yes, sir.
You were talking about this 900 years that people live. So, and people, you said they all moved to different areas of the earth. So, if today travel and people coming back together, is there a possibility that our lifespan could start to increase because of that?
It could. You know, scientists, geneticists wrestle with what is our potential lifespan. Now, I'll get very technical on you here. The reason we die is because our cells stop reproducing. Our cells stop reproducing and we die. Why do our cells stop reproducing? Because our DNA will keep reproducing, but every time it reproduces, a little piece of the end of the DNA falls off. Those are called telomeres. Every time we reproduce and we get a year older, our DNA reproduces, it gets shorter and shorter and shorter because the telomeres start falling off. When all of the telomeres are off our DNA, the DNA shuts off and it doesn't reproduce anymore. So we might say, well, what caused these people to live 10 times longer for this? So your question, though, was, is it possible that, you know, our age could go down or maybe we could go up? If we could figure out how to stop our DNA from falling apart when it reproduces. So maybe this wasn't the problem with ancients. Maybe their DNA kept reproducing and the telomeres were a lot longer on it. So they could reproduce for 900 years until the telomeres stopped. Because it's very interesting. All these patriarchs died basically within 10 to 20 years of one another. Right? I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's telling us something of the created genetics that God put into humans before the flood. Yes, Neil.
Kind of referring to like cell division, the inability to stop cell dividing.
Well, it's yes.
Because
They do, right? And it's, I'm
So, one thing that living longer is slowing down the rate of cell division.
exactly, right. I don't know if you heard that. He said one way to slow down aging is to slow down the rate of cell division so the telomeres don't fall off on the end. So the cells still reproduce, but they take longer to duplicate, right? Now, it's much more complicated than this because our brain cells don't reproduce. Our heart cells do not reproduce, right? Some things do reproduce, though, but not every cell does. Sometimes a cell will reproduce madly, and what do you get? You get a tumor. You get a cancerous tumor because it doesn't stop reproducing. It just goes, and it just keeps reproducing. Something happens there. So scientists actually are looking at tumor formation of can we learn something from that to potentially extend human lifetime? What is it about cancer cells that they never stop reproducing? Again, this gets very heady stuff, and any geneticists would probably laugh at me because I'm being too simple here. But this is kind of where a lot of this thinking is going right now. Yes, Royce.
About a month ago, I sent you an email to the James Webb Telescope.
Uh-huh.
Discovered something that contradicts the Big Bang theory.
Mm-hmm.
What I thought I read, you said, no, that's not it. Can you tell me?
Well, it's what they discovered. So the James Webb Telescope. So again, this is going to get very heady. So the Big Bang says everything started as a speck, and it blew up, and it kept expanding, right? So when you're at a telescope and you're looking way, way out to the distance, you're looking at the universe when it was very young, right? Because you're looking at it, when it was out there. And what the James Webb Telescope has found is no matter where they look, they find solar systems and planetary systems that are complete. As far back as they go, they're like, we're looking at the moment of the Big Bang, and we're seeing fully grown solar systems. They're like, these things take millions of years to form, yet we know it only arose a couple thousand years after the Big Bang, yet it's fully formed. So the conversation we had was, this disproves the Big Bang. No, what it does is evolutionary scientists say planets form a lot quicker than they ever thought. But see, that's pushing the answer, that's not answering the question. Creation scientists say no matter where we look, God created the universe fully functioning instantly. He created it instantly. He created galaxies. He created that planetary system that I showed you. He created it instantly. It didn't form over millions of years. So when scientists look at this and say, boy, it just looks like everything is together, it's old, we need to rethink our theory, right? This stuff forms quicker and stuff like that. So we're looking at the same data, but we're coming to different conclusions. We're looking at this data as creation scientists and saying, this is exactly what we would predict with God's creation of the universe. The evolutionist says, no, we still need to refine our Big Bang theory because things form quicker than they do. I've put you all asleep. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so you lived to your 800, 900 years old. Did women have to have babies for 800 years? That's one I've always wanted an answer to. That's a lot.
So the Jews have a legend. There's an author, Flavius Josephus. He was a Roman at the time when the Romans sacked Jerusalem in 70 AD. And Flavius Josephus was a Jew and he was a Roman. He thought his ancestry, the Jews, were going to be wiped out. The Romans were going to wipe them out. So he sat down to write a history of the Jews. He called it the Antiquities of the Jews. He basically paraphrases the entire Old Testament stories. And the cool thing is he names Noah's wife. He names the 63 children that Adam and Eve had. So I stopped there. And yes, women would have had monstrous families, right? Now, Flavius Josephus was just a writer, but it's very interesting. Now, it's not scripture when you're reading, and he's articulating, I think by memory, all the legends that the Jews had with stuff. Yes, there's also thought that humankind's sexually matured a lot later in life. The story of Abraham and Isaac. How old was Isaac when Abraham said, Isaac, it's time for you to get a wife. You're going to go to my brother and Laban, and you're going to marry you're going to marry your cousin. I'm sorry, you're going to marry your cousin. He was 40 years old. He said, Isaac, it's time to go out. You're 40 years old. In fact, if you look at Scripture, the age at the time of birth of the oldest child was 3 times older than what we are now. So this goes to kind of what we were just talking here about. Maybe the ancients lived longer because they just aged slower. And we see a hint of this, and that the age at the time of birth of these people was a lot older. 40 to 60 was when they had their first child. Right? How old was Abraham when he had his first child? Was he 90 or something? I know he makes it, what was it? He was, right? And, okay. Right, he was, yeah, right, he had Ishmael first. But, I always find it interesting that, again, you see he's like, I'm 100 years old. I don't think I can have kids anymore. What, are you kidding me? Right? But again, you just see these little hints that things were not exactly like they are today when it comes to human longevity and things like that. So another interesting thing I read was, right after the Tower of Babel, when God confused all the languages, and it says immediately after that, and all these languages became the Medes, the Persians, this or that. They list 70 different people. A lot of people think that there were 70 languages that were created. And God categorized each one of those. Again, this is just me talking, okay? Right? I do sometimes get off on stuff like this and get off in left field, but this is something like this. And you know why that's cool? Because linguistics scientists today are struggling to find the mother language. What was the first language that humans talked about, right? And they can go back, they can combine, right? French and Italian are almost identical to one another. They're almost identical. Spanish and Portuguese are almost identical, right? So those are simple, right? And you can kind of go back, and scientists, they run up against a wall because you run up against things like Latin and Chinese. They're like, they're not even, how do you connect those two? How do you connect those two? So scientists, these linguistics, they still struggle with this, and it's almost like multiple languages arose simultaneously in multiple locations, and they're indistinguishable in terms of how to connect them with one another, right? They're really speaking towards what Scripture is talking about. Now, whether it's 70 or not, I don't know. It doesn't matter, right? But there was a finite number that exist. And I've heard people say that really Hebrew was the first language that everyone spoke. And one of the reasons was Adam, right? Adam means man. And it sounds like dirt, right? Because he was taken from the ground. So Adam, when I speak with kids at school, I say, Adam, people didn't call him Adam, they called him the man. Because that's what Adam means in Hebrew, it's the man. So every time they saw him, they'd say, the man. So I just offer that again as my goofy, Dr. Peil's goofy reading too much stuff. All right, are you ready for pizza? Or no, Pastor has a question.
Just an observation, the last NOVA episode focused on the whale fossils in the Sahara.
Yeah, so whale fossils are curious because scientists will say whale fossils show evidence of like tiny little legs in the back and so on. And so they use that singular piece of data to indicate that whales used to walk on land and then walked into the water and became whales, right? Isn't science wonderful how we can elude all this stuff from this? But those little appendages are not legs. They're actually part of their reproductive organs. Those things actually get involved with whales reproducing, and you can let your imagination run wild how 2 whales reproduce, but those appendages are actually involved in that singular act. So, right, I didn't see that, and I try not to watch stuff like that because it just upsets me, right? When I was in my 30s, I would watch it and take notes, but it's the same thing over and over. It just doesn't, it doesn't matter. So pizza's downstairs, all right. Thank you all very much. All right, the pizza's downstairs. I have no instructions other than just to go downstairs and have the pizza. So thank you. Have a good night.